Thank you. Thank you again for joining us for the book launch of Black Iconoclasm, Public Symbols, Racial Progress, and Post-Ferguson America. We are very excited for this roundtable with Dr. Charles Athanasopoulos, author of the book. And thank you, whether you're here with us in Denny Hall or in Zoom, thank you so much for your presence. We're excited to share this conversation with you. Before that, we would like to extend our special thank you to our co-sponsors, the Department of African American and African Studies and the Department of English at The Ohio State University. Thank you for your support in making this event possible. My name is Alison Pavon Tadeo, and I am an Afro-Ecuadorian Black woman and first-year master's student in the AAAS program at The Ohio State University, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. I'm honored to guide us through what promises to be a very thought-provoking conversation. But before we get into that, let me introduce you to our panelists. Of course, we have Dr. Charles Athanasopoulos. He is an assistant professor of African American African Studies and English at The Ohio State University. He received his PhD in rhetoric and communication from the University of Pittsburgh, and his research interests lie at the intersection of Black rhetorics, media, and culture. He has published numerous peer-reviewed articles in venues such as Lateral, the Journal of Cultural Studies Association, and the Western Journal of Communication. We also have here with us Dr. Salika Eva Oromi. They, also going under the artist name NHI, is an antidisciplinary artist, assistant professor of Black sexualities in the Department of African American and African Studies at The Ohio State University, and a 2021-2023 Carter G. Woodson Predoctoral Fellow at the University of Virginia. They engage Black material and digital publics as landscapes to trace the human sexual geographies between the relation of Black femme and a spectator. Their relationality is tethered to the logics of shame, desire, and pleasure. Additionally, she considers the discursiveness of critical humanism as a way to chart the figuration of Black horror vis-a-vis the counter and anti-human. As a scholar and performance-based photographer, she uses the experimental approaches of research creation to engage Black study. They are currently working on 2 book projects, Haunted Themes, Hunting Spectators, and NHI in 3 acts. In her work, they study both the uses and incongruence of the ontological and spectator import and gaze of the Black public's relationship to the deviant femme subject. She watches through Black studies, Black queer feminists, and mapping dance and performance studies, visual culture, and Black porn sex work studies. And finally, let me introduce you to Dr. E. Chirulu, who is joining us through Zoom. He is an assistant professor of rhetorical studies in the Department of Communication at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. His research lies on the intersection of race, rhetoric, and media, with a specific focus on racialized public feelings and digital media platforms. His current research project is about white nationalism, rhetoric, and racial anxiety on digital platforms. Thank you again for our panelists who will be engaging in this roundtable with us. Now I would like to welcome Dr. Charles Athanasopoulos, who will share a few words and provide an introduction to read Black Iconoclasm.
Thank you, Allison, for the wonderful introduction. What's good, everybody? I'm Charles Athanasopoulos, or as my students call me, Dr. A. I wanted to say thank you to the panelists, so Dr. Z, Allison, and Dr. Chabrolu for joining us. And again, thank you to our co-sponsors for the event. But before I do anything else, I want to begin by thanking the person that I dedicated the project to, which is my mother, Christina, or as I call her, Ma Dukes. I also wanted a special shout out to my father, Sal, my uncle Alo, Aunt Vicky, Uncle Mike, my papu, and my abuela. And also wanted to give a special shout out to 2 very special mentors, one of which is here with us today. So Rashad William Evans, who flew in from Tennessee to be with us, has been my mentor since high school. I believe I was 15 years old, and he decided to mentor me and help me get to college and be here in the first place. And then thank you to Louis M. Mirage at University of British Columbia, who was actually an alum of the English program here at OSU. And 2 weeks into his Black Rhetorics course in 2019, I just went up and I was like, Lou, yeah, I need you. Help me out. Help me get through grad school. And he really has been there for me since, and a real inspiration. So to both Rashad and Lou, it wouldn't be possible without you. So thank you. And there's so many other people I could thank professionally. And so I'm sorry if I leave anybody out. But finally, but not least, thank you to my partner, Corinne Mitsuye Seguino, for pushing me intellectually constantly, for endlessly supporting me, for being reader one of all of my manuscripts, and most importantly, telling me when my writing is getting a bit corny and having me revise a little bit to get it where it needs to be. Yeah, so now I'll sort of jump into a quick overview of the project. I wrote this project to reflect on the last decade since Ferguson, since the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. But more than Ferguson, I guess I was intrigued at all of the discourse around Black radical disruption, but then the co-option of that disruption as well, and the sort of ongoing conversations about the relationship between Black radical resistance and institutional co-option as a seeming cycle, an endless cycle that keeps recurring across space and time. And so that idea of a cycle, and how do we break that cycle to perhaps move past this deeply unethical anti-Black world, and that is where I sort of came upon this vocabulary of racial iconography and Black iconoclasm. And so when I say racial iconography, I really mean the social codes of race, gender, class, and sexuality that Sylvia Wynter describes as the social codes of Western man. She personifies them that way. And of course, that is indebted to Frantz Fanon's thinking about sociogeny, the social production of a value system, which is white over Black. And then, of course, that is also indebted to Nicole Fleetwood, who wrote a project in 2015, I believe, on racial icons. So there's the racial iconography, the conceptual values, and then there are the particular public symbols that reflect the conceptual iconography, and that's what I call a racial icon, right? And that could be a person like former President Barack Obama. It could be a popular, supposedly progressive film, et cetera, et cetera. And from there, Black iconoclasm then is forms of Black radical activism and thinking that fracture, they unmoor, they disorder those conceptual values, as well as perhaps the particular symbol. But that doesn't mean that it's necessarily a physical shattering, right? It's more of a conceptual undoing, which could include a physical shattering of a statue, but it's not limited to such. The other thing that this is partially informed by my childhood being mixed and growing up in an Greek Orthodox church, which is really huge on iconography. If you've ever been to an Orthodox church, there's sort of all of these images bringing to life these biblical stories. But then it's also related to my undergraduate training at Wake Forest and thinking anti-Blackness as a religious structure. And then my graduate training in rhetoric and communication as a way to think, there's this structure here, but how does that play out in the sort of messiness of everyday lived experience through our self-image, our interpersonal interactions, right? And so I wanted to think the intersection of structure, right, the conceptual iconography, and then its contingent manifestation in culture through the particular symbols. And then I guess the last thing overall is that I'm trying to reframe the idea of iconoclasm, where usually it's rooted in a Eurocentric understanding of you have an object that is venerated, and you want to either physically shatter that image or say that all images are bad because you have some sort of like scriptocentric rational culture over here, or you have a better image that you think should be held up in opposition to the image that you are critiquing. And because of that, modern iconoclasm studies thinks of iconoclasm as necessarily paradoxical in the sense that it will always lead to a new icon. And so what I'm suggesting is that Black iconoclasm is a form of iconoclasm that emphasizes liminality, fractures, disorders, messiness. And it's not necessarily saying no to all images. But the thing that makes this distinct is that in saying that the anti-Black world is unethical, that its conceptual iconography needs to be undone and destroying particular public symbols, Black iconoclasm refuses to offer a supposedly pure image of a Black world after the anti-Black world, which I think would reproduce that cycle. So instead, what does it mean to sit in that liminal space where the current present must be disordered, but you don't necessarily have an image of the future that is after it? And that is sort of guided by Frantz Fanon, the idea of a program of complete disorder, which I'll talk about more specifically. But essential to Fanon's thinking is the idea that we must invent something beyond Western man. And so I worry that when we begin from the presupposition that we have a clear image of what comes after the anti-Black world, that we then produce a formula that we reproduce, a blueprint that we try to like crank through the formula to get to a certain place. And that is that's not invention anymore, right? It's just regurgitating something through various genres. And so, the prologue and the epilogue are both titled Twilight of the Icons. It's a riff on Friedrich Nietzsche's infamous or famous title, Twilight of the Idols, right? Where this metaphor of the twilight is this space between night and day, and you're not sure which one comes after. And so thus metaphorically represents this idea of Black iconoclasm as holding us in this liminal suspension. And to give you an idea, in the prologue, I sort of begin thinking about Kehinde Wiley's iconic series, these series of iconic portraitures that will represent figures like St. John the Baptist as urban Black men. And he talks about, trying to warp the vocabulary of Orthodox iconography to represent Black men from a negative representation to a positive representation. And I also talk about this story of going to a mandatory confession as part of a religious school, and then sort of confessing my struggles with believing in the Abrahamic God and questioning why, like my mother as a working class Afro-Puerto Rican woman, why isn't she a saint? Why is it these, white male monks from the Middle Ages? And, the priest sort of got mad at me and told me it was blasphemy, right? And then the third thing that I put that next to is the renaming of the Bronxdale houses to the Sotomayor houses in the Bronx. And in each of those instances, what occurs is an attempt to say, I'm represented negatively, and I don't want to be seen as a demon. I want to be seen as an angel, rather than calling into question the very scale by which angels and demons are constructed. And so, sort of questioning this impulse to create a counter icon that can stand up to Western man. And so then I throw that into Crisis in the prologue to then offer this argument about reframing iconoclasm. And so I generally argue that across you're never going to find a pure artifact, a pure iconoclastic artifact, or a pure iconic artifact, that everything that you look at, whether it be a film, a person, a speech, street art, they will each contain excess and residues. There will be forms of Black radical activism and thinking that exceed Western man in some ways, but in some ways they will also contain residues of the very world that they're trying to undo. And so rather than just rendering a yes-no statement on entire schools of thought or movements, right, or films, how do we begin to build a practice of discerning that excess from those residues to evolve our thinking and our practices? And so that's what I do in chapter 2, right? I think about the evolution of the Black Lives Matter movement from 2014 to now, and I perform what I call an iconoclastic genealogy. So rather than a proper history, I'm thinking about the evolution of the value Black Lives Matter, right? A hashtag to an organization on the ground in Ferguson, to a nonprofit structure that becomes known as the Black Lives Matter Global Network, to all of the internal criticisms from groups like the BLM 10, BLM Grassroots, Mass Action for Black Liberation, which used to be BLM Cincinnati. And what we find is that there's all of these internal criticisms that are happening, these internal fracture and fault lines and transitions. So there isn't one unitary Black Lives Matter movement, right? There's all of these forces with iconographic and iconoclastic potentials, right? And, the issue becomes when we render BLM down to the iconic co-founders of the global network, and then it becomes yes or no: are the co-founders good, or is BLM a fraud, right? And it sort of X's out all of these other forms of engaging around BLM. The next chapter after that sort of thinks about the iconic image that we've constructed of Fanon himself and the different camps that theorize around decolonization. So there's the people have interpreted him as there's anti-racist Fanonism, there's Marxist Fanonism, there's decolonial Fanonism, there's feminist Fanonism, there's revolutionary humanist Fanonism, and there's Afro-pessimist Fanonism, and they all are always arguing about who has a proper reading of Fanon and accusing them of, oh, you take him out of cultural context, or, you forget that he's interested in material decolonization, et cetera, et cetera. So I go through these, I particularly focus on the dispute between the revolutionary humanist perspective and the anti-humanist Afro-pessimist perspective. And I sort of think about, thinking with scholars like Winter or R.A. Judy, and the way that they're trying to think of a non-teleological, a non-ontological form of human, and how that perhaps does exceed Western man, but then thinking the critiques that come from the anti-humanists and how they're pushing them to think, well, perhaps there are residues there that you're leaving unthought. From there, I think about the critiques, that the sort of Fred Moten's Black mysticism has of Afro-pessimism. So in many ways, Afro-pessimism exceeds Western man, but Moten has arguments as to how perhaps there's some residues. And then I do my own reading of the way that Black mysticism exceeds Western man, but perhaps contains certain residues in its reading of social life, which we can get into the details of. So throughout, kind of not saying yes or no to each school, but thinking what is generative and limited across them, and doing my own reading of Fanon's statement that decolonization is a program of complete disorder. From there, I parlay that to engage Fanon to think about speech and communication, right? So this is where I theorize Fanonian slips, which is, in moments of racial tension, someone tries to speak to soothe that tension, but something that they say actually accidentally reveals a deeper investment in this racial iconography. So something like Biden saying, poor kids are just as bright as white kids, right? Or Clinton's, I keep hot sauce in my bag. So there's, or Killer Mike getting up, in Atlanta after the Atlanta protests with a shirt that says "Kill your masters," but his speech is all about he's at a police press conference and he's telling protesters to stop protesting, right? And the point is that it's not just a simple contradiction. It is that their image of Black liberation has been warped by the white mask, and so they don't actually register it as a contradiction. And so then, there's activism, there's the theory, there's the actual rhetoric, speech, interpersonal interactions, and the way that icons manifest in that way. And then from there, I move into a chapter on post-Ferguson American film. And so I look at Antebellum, Judas and the Black Messiah, and the two Black Panther films. And across each of them, they're exceeding Western man. They're trying to reimagine Black subjectivity beyond a racist status quo. And there's many great things that each of these films do, but each of them also have their own limitations. And then what happens when we're an audience that watches all four of those films? And in Black Panther, the CIA agent's a good guy. In Antebellum, the FBI stops the people enslaving people. But in Judas and the Black Messiah, they're the ones assassinating, right, Fred Hampton. So like, what are these contradictory images that we are getting? And this is where I engage Winter's idea of a deciphering practice rather than film criticism of like, this isn't a good film, this is a great film, right? But a more nuanced approach to the messages that we're getting. And then finally, there's the chapter on street art, where I use Glissant's notion of a poetics of relation to think the evolution of a graffiti wall turned into a mural in its three different iterations as a poetics of visual relation, that it has totality, it has chaos, and it also has echoes between those two things. But actually, that notion of relation, it also breaks apart this neat idea of a cycle, because in fact, there's multiple forms of relation happening, right? There's multiple residues and excesses rather than just one neat circle recurring. And that the final part of the project is Black Icarus, which is a sort of allegory for commentary on Black flight and fugitivity. And so I repurposed the story where it's not about Icarus sort of flying correctly and not going too high or too low. But in fact, it is that his father, Daedalus, builds the wings in his plan for escape from the same conceptual and physical resources that the labyrinth is based upon, right? Because Daedalus is the one who builds the labyrinth originally. And so the point being then that the way that we begin to narrate Black flight and Black fugitivity begins to take on the desire for epistemological closure to the extent that your flight is doomed from the very beginning. And so, again, kind of holding us within that idea of how do we stay in the twilight, in that liminal? How do we take the leap, not knowing if we can fly out at all, let alone right? So that's the overall hope of the project. That these various things across activism, theory, film, street art, interpersonal interactions can be used contextually and imperfectly, differently by different people, rather than me presenting a formula and a general orientation to think excess and residues constantly. Thank you.
First of all, thank you so much, Dr. A, for inviting me and also just reading your work. It was just brilliant. It was wonderful. So I wanted to give a few remarks, and I can give the question either at the end of these remarks or I can kind of curtail the question. Okay. Okay, sounds good. All right. So in your chapter entitled Disordered Absolute, Proposing Black Iconoclasm, you write that your commitment to Black study is vitalized by a particular question. Additionally, you point us to the telos of the aspiration toward a commitment, a Fanonian prayer to always remain questioning. Your use of the grammar of commitment to Black liberation and Fanon's plea as a religious concern toward a particular level of commitment urges us to consider the religious practice of a particular devotion toward Black study, and in turn, the religious practices that valorize and deify Western man. You turn religiosity on its head as the unthought of the religious and secularized pairings and circuits that produce Western man, or man one and man two, the sociogenic stabilizers of anti-Blackness, as considered by Frantz Fanon and Sylvia Wynter. Here I would like to pair the relationships between commitment, devotion, and religiosity. As you continue on within this chapter, you architect foundational understandings for recognizing Fanonianisms and anti-Western humanisms. An example of this relational path would be Wynter's use of a new science of being human, which is an interpretation of Fanon, and revolutionary humanism, which is a detachment from Western humanism. But as you brilliantly articulate, through Wynter's science-centric register, she orients herself toward the commitment to Fanon as the psychiatrist, a scientized articulation of behavior, and a faithlessness in Fanon as a theologian, a prayer warrior. Because of the restoration of a faithfulness towards science by way of the aspirational appeal to eradicate the Western human from the ashes of the desolation of this colonial figure and the creature or the creation of a new figure, the Western human is still retrieved from the ashes as a kind of resurrection and access point of a new faith, producing a similar hierarchical order of the human. The unintentional commitment and devotion here to this Western humanist project through the scientists, and I still argue ultimately a humanist project, as origin will consistently knock us on our asses around the human question, demonstrates a conflicted and paradoxical relationship to the colonial script and ultimately the symbol. I thought that this aspect of your articulation was stunning because it is a criticism so graciously conveyed that destabilizes how one would reorient or do differently a commitment to our icons of Black study and thereby the practice of Black study. Black iconoclasm through the grammars of cracks, fissures, residue, excess, slips, unmoors and disorders our engagements toward commitment. I'm Christian and I also practice Ifa. And one of the trappings that I found many believers and devotees bound and embattled by was this idea that even within the face of suffering and the unknowns for the reasons of why, it may have been precipitated was that one does not question God. However, as my father was and still is a pastor, my mother now deceased, and my grandmother still active within her Baptist church community, there was a reordering of the understanding that one does not question God. My grandmother instead told me to absolutely question God because ultimately, so much about the presence of and question of God and what is allowed and not allowed will consistently always come under scrutiny with the troubles and lamentations of the world. Now, obviously, I'm not asking for people to necessarily believe in God, but instead I use this small story to express the ways in which Black iconoclasm disembowels the expression of eating the meat and discarding of the bones and calls us once again to engage every piece. So returning to this notion of commitment, devotion, and religiosity as a faith-based practice of Black study and the Pannonian prayer to always be questioning, I believe that your work is also a prayer to question our beliefs and question who or what we believe. It is not necessarily the question of whether we believe in our icons of Black study, but rather that through devotion, commitment, and even religiosity, that questioning demonstrates the belief in the practice of Black study and openness toward the profits of Black study. Said differently, a critique of our icons of Black study is not a disposal, but rather a different engagement and commitment toward the project of Black study. So with all of this that is said, Dr. A, how does your work, Black Iconoclasm, do a commitment toward Black study and the project of Black liberation differently? And what is the prayer that you enact as a resuscitation of Black iconoclasm?
Should I go now? Hello? Okay, so should I start talking?
Yeah, you're in the mic. Oh, yeah, you're right. Yeah, you're good. Go ahead. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, I'd like to hello everybody, and also thank you, Charles, for this opportunity to kind of engage with your work, which is that it's a good book. But I'd like to kind of start with how it felt to read this book. It's kind of strange. I feel like I could feel my body relaxing, like I wasn't on guard as much as I usually am. I don't know if it was because I know you in the world, the words kind of felt familiar, like I kind of hear your voice, or if it was your writing style or the content of the arguments. But it was nice. There's also just a lot of care in how you engage with other scholars in your analysis, which was also quite nice. A kind of a bit of a bit of a breath of fresh air. And the last thing I want to note is that your writing doesn't feel driven by a certain kind of sense of speed and urgency to attend to the immediacy of crisis in the terms of order that, like, how politics wants us to think of crisis, right? The temporality of the present and the future imperfect, your focus on liminality and the cracks, operates a little bit differently from a vanguardist kind of temporal logic of outpacing and outmaneuvering the adaptations and co-options of Western man, which is again just kind of nice. But I'll focus on my substantive reflections on pedagogy that comes from kind of reading the book, kind of that is something compelled by reading the book, both in terms of pedagogical iconography and pedagogical iconoclasm. The first thing I want to start with is an example of pedagogical iconography. I'm thinking here about both the chapter on BLM and the chapter on Fanon. When I got my current job, I went into the archives of old syllabi, and what I found was that many of the intro to rhetoric courses was that they would start with this, like an assignment that was an analysis of Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech. There would usually not be any other days dedicated to Black rhetoric explicitly, or even just race more generally, just the one iconic speech, and then all of the rest of a certain kind of narration of the Western rhetorical canon, Aristotle through maybe even a little bit of Foucault, right? That one speech becomes a training tool that repeatedly produces the iconization of MLK as a justification of the discipline's progressive liberal democratic ethos, because you're seeing this be an assignment for like 150 students a semester over and over and over again. Disciplinarity is made sense of by using the most visible icon of Black political struggle as a medium for entry and especially initiation into white institutional life. But that also can't really be the end of the story there. What acts of Black iconoclasm happened with Black students who were engaging with that assignment? I certainly will never know, but now there's a potential for my rendition of this example itself to be disarticulated on a different kind of set of terms. Now, another example of something that seems like but isn't quite the opposite, like pedagogical iconoclasm. I think that speaks to how difficult it is to teach about Black liberation struggles or Black social movements without leaning into the cycle of iconography and iconoclasm that is troubled throughout the book. So, in part as a response to the earlier example, and also because the article itself is quite good, I start my upper level race and rhetoric course with a piece from Andre Johnson and Anthony Stone Jr. on MLK's post 1965 turn towards a more pessimistic and prophetic pattern of speech. But the risk I've run, and which I'm pretty sure has come into fruition, but I'm not entirely certain of that, is that setting up an iconoclastic engagement with MLK as a sign of colorblind racial progress and uplift, and kind of being like, maybe this isn't the case. That kind of attempt ends up being an attempt to just revalorize MLK as an iconic leader of a radical that represents a certain kind of radical and anti-imperialist socialism, regardless of the fact that the latter is kind of accurate, in terms of reading some of that turn, but also there are differences in how MLK is kind of approaching those questions than what people might want to read. But what really I think gets lost in the switcheroo of revalorization is I think precisely what the chapter on graffiti and glissant kind of shows us. And that's like that there's this more low frequency and uncertain way that social movements are enacted that is more necessary to kind of bring out rather than just kind of buying into Martin Luther King as a Black Messiah, as you kind of gesture towards in the analysis of Judas and the Black Messiah. And that cannot just get resolved by then trotting out like Bayard Rustin and Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer as like this kind of alternative pseudo intersectional iconography that gets us closer to the truth of the civil rights movement, which not only flattens their lives and beliefs, but also is a limiting gesture as you get away from, for example, the small group discussions between Baker and students at Black colleges where people kind of plot and plan and joke and cry and shout and laugh together or are hurt by each other, or maybe just kind of sit in a corner silent, kind of watching and thinking. Or another example would be the more mundane and banal low frequency deliberation that went into setting up the transportation infrastructure that made it so that people could get to work on time while participating in bus boycotts. But again, just as I kind of articulate that, there is also, again, a revalorization. And beyond that, I can't really predict how Black students in my courses will take up what I set up. And I think your overall project pushes us to rethink what it looks like to embrace the messiness of pedagogy, the uncertainty in emergent moments when conversation kind of gets loosened up. But it also begs the question of how political education outside of the academy can also tend to fall into some of the same traps, but also offer different conditions for invention. And are we talking about the question right now, or are we looping back to it?
We're going to come back to your question. We're going to just wrap up the comments and then we'll go through the questions.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Dr. A, for including me. So let me start with my own reflections on the project. I was particularly captivated by Dr. Athanasopoulos' writing style, especially his ability to guide us towards Black iconoclasm by connecting it with his own personal experience. From his childhood reflections, questioning the religious icons of the Orthodox Church and trying to replace them with the image of his mother, to his real-time engagement with the Black Lives Matter movement, Dr. Athanasopoulos skillfully weaves personal narrative with larger social critiques. This approach inspired me to reflect on my own experiences and identities and how they intersect with the spaces of iconography and iconoclasm. I approached this reading as a student, a social organizer, if you can say that, and as a questioner. A memory surfaced from my upbringing. Growing up in a household with social organizer and Afro-Ecuadorian activists, I always find myself hearing the discourses of Black liberation, from the struggle to gain recognition of Afro-Ecuadorian as part of the nation, to public demonstration advocating for policies that promote welfare and sanctioning injustice. I also witnessed how many of these radical disruptions in discourse, public space, and social imaginaries were often compromised by personal interest, disorganization, or simply because the ideals could not be fully translated into the political sphere. As Dr. A might articulate, this is part of the cycle of iconography and iconoclasm. Recently, a new issue for social organization among Afro-Ecuadorians has emerged: the suspicious decrease of nearly 1 million Afro-Ecuadorians in the recent census. My mother, a social organizer, and I found ourselves questioning the outcome. Should we continue down the radical path and demanding the government admit this error and declare the census result null? Or will this movement once again be trapped by state policies of denial and postponement of Afro-Ecuadorian needs? As I read Black Iconoclasm, the idea of embracing liminality seemed simple, yet it opened an entirely new space for thinking about the trajectory of Black liberation movements, past, present, and future. Caught at times, exhausted by duality, I have forgotten to consider what the liberation project truly entails: a constant state of rupture, unfinished, imperfect, always in progress. My mind, trained to seek precise and perhaps immediate solutions, now open to the possibility that the answer lies in the uncertainty. This duality of thought is also part of the structure of Western men, which limits us from embracing chaos. Dr. A's reading of Fanon reminds us that decolonization is a project of the third absolute. It's not just the destabilization of icons of Western men, but the process through which we construct them. In this sense, the tabula rasa, scraping the slate clean, means not only erase all icons, but also the very ways in which we create meaning. For me, Black iconoclasm is an invitation to reject totality and certainty, to avoid simplistic views of Black liberation that keep us trapped in a constant duality between assimilation and radicalism. Instead, it invites us to look at chaos, failure, and certainty. But more importantly, echoing Fanon, it invites us to question. Questioning then becomes a liminal space between excess and scarcity, where new possibilities emerge. Returning to my initial anecdote, I now recognize the decades, even centuries of Afro-Ecuadorian social organization, the moments of fracture in the Ecuadorian social code, the new forms of resistance and agency that emerge with each generation, and also the uncertainty of what comes next. Rather than confining myself to predetermined structure of cycling thought, I now see this moment as a space of potentiality, where liminality becomes a site for creation, and most importantly, for questioning. As Dr. A repeats through the text, Black iconoclasm does not provide a clear vision of the world, but it does invite us to continue questioning the established one. To echo the book closing words, we must take the leap towards the unknown, not knowing whether we can fly at all. And with that, I think that we can move on with the questions. Like if each of our panelists can repeat their questions, we can start with Dr. C, maybe.
Sure. So I think one of the last things that I said is that a critique of our icons of Black study is not a disposal, but rather a different engagement and commitment toward the project of Black study. So with that said, how does your work, Black Iconoclasm, do a commitment toward Black study and the project of Black liberation differently? And what is the prayer that you enact as a resuscitation of Black iconoclasm?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I think part of this requires being honest about my own theological investments. So, you know, generally I approach this not from an Abrahamic perspective, but from a Buddhist perspective. And so when I think about systems of power and violence, I do think of it as attachments and unwholesome attachments and desires that keep us locked in a cycle, what Buddhism would call samsara, right? This endless cycle. And nirvana is usually translated as enlightenment, but in fact, it means a blowing away of the self. All right. And the metaphor that's given is just like if you had a dandelion and you blew away all of the petals, right, until it sort of was in the larger ecology. And so I take that, and the connection here is actually that Fanon talks about a Manichaean world, right? And Manichaeism is actually a religious thing. It is one that is a syncretic religion that mixes Abrahamic beliefs and Buddhist theology, right? And so he's arguing that we live in a world that is split between this idea of the realm of good, of sacredness, and of evilness, right? And that in that whiteness appears as the civilizing, the sacred angelic force, and blackness registers as demonic, right? And what often happens in our discussions of Black liberation, there's just sort of this oomph of certainty of let's get rid of this thing here, let's critique the white God and offer a counter image of a Black God. There's this anti-Black world, here's this counter image here, right? And what happens is that we begin then to replicate the sort of primary, I think, thing that Western man teaches us to want, which is epistemological closure, transparency, certainty. We become attached to those things to ground ourselves, right? And so I think about the process of disordering that Fanon talks about as a loosening of those investments and attachments, as a way of disordering not just the world out there, but our very sense of ourself as an illusion that is tied up in that larger structure. And so it kind of relates then to this idea of a cycle of icon and iconoclasm, and this cycle of violence sort of based on these attachments. And so, I kind of approach Black iconoclasm, the way that I would describe it is what we call a negative theology, which is one that rejects making any positive claim about the essence of an afterlife, the essence of a deity figure, because in negative theology, it is that our sort of human consciousness is limited. It is too limited to actually adequately capture that thing. And so I'm kind of adjusting that to say that the concept of Black liberation requires such an invention beyond our purview in this anti-Black world that we really can't make those positive statements of what it truly is. But we sure know what it's not when we look at this world, right? So it brings me back then to Fanon's prayer that is the epigraph of this chapter, right? To always make him, he says, a man, but a person who always questions, right? Undoes, right? That he says, like, let's dispense with trying to mimic the European world, right? To invent something new. And in fact, in even the opening 3 pages of The Wretched of the Earth, and this is the Phil Cox translation, he says, I could tell you what the new post-colonial nation would look like. I could tell you about the economy. I could tell you about the government. But instead, what I want to emphasize is tabula rasa, from the outset, that the a priori values that we hold so dear are cleared out, right? And so that's the emphasis for me is always undoing canon, undoing this thing that you believe to be the established commandments of Black liberation, to be the established canon of Black study, to be the proper interpretation. Because in doing so, you seek a kind of epistemological closure and certainty that actually mimics the thing that you are trying to undo and moves us away from that spirit of invention. And this is, in fact, my criticism of the idea of a new science of the human as trying to sort of say, here are these codes of Western man. Now let's sort of look at this almost counter code, the disordering of those codes to these various genres of the human. And this is sort of echoing David Marriott's criticism of Winter's New Science of the Human in a piece called Inventions in Existence, that it then again thinks invention in teleological terms, which is, here is the thing that is bad. We will create a science that shows us how it constructs itself. And now through our new science of human consciousness, we can begin to construct sort of guidelines or genres for us to then think about this new way of being human, rather than sitting in that space of, is it human? If it is, like, why are we creating a science out of it, a systematized sort of, program? And similarly, this is the criticism that I levy in thinking about Black social life through the concepts of that Moten takes from this Buddhist thinker Nishida, in the piece Black Mysticism in the Flesh. He cites Buddhist theology in this Buddhist koan to think Black mysticism, and this idea of Black fugitivity in social life. But in fact, I trace back Nishida as a preeminent imperial thinker of Japan, who uses this concept of a pure land. It's sort of a strand of Buddhist thought of Pure Land, right? Where if you work to undo your investments by praying to this particular figure, Amida Buddha, you can be reborn not into nirvana, but into this place that is a Pure Land that is separate from, the earth as we know it, but you're not yet at nirvana. But if you are reborn in that Pure Land, you can see the path to nirvana better than those not born in that Pure Land. And this is the part that Moten cites to say that Black social life is this sort of separate, undercommon space from the world, right? The proper anti-Black sociality. And then from that purview of sociality, it becomes clearer how to undo this anti-Black world, right? But in fact, it is that very concept that allowed Nishida to support the Japanese Empire, which said, well, hey, Japan is a national Pure Land that is better able to apprehend nirvana. So we're going to go around civilizing these other people and bringing them into nirvana, right? Replicating a kind of different genre of Western man's Propter Nos project on behalf of us, right? They go around and civilize the world, right? And so what I'm saying there then is, whether it's the human or this concept of the other undercommons as a Pure Land, both of them are looking for a kind of thing to hang their hat on, an epistemological closure, right? That offers them this path to this new thing, rather than sitting in that space of complete disorder, and just taking the leap without that thing that you can attach to. And so I guess really the prayer is an echo of Fanon's prayer, but it's also a sort of just generally a negative theological approach to the concept of Black liberation, a mode of humility that foregoes epistemological closure and foregoes purity. Anybody can add on to that before we move on to, any of the panelists can add on to that before we move on to the next question. So if there's no,
I do think that actually kind of helps lead into the question I got for you as well. And this is one of those questions that, like, it's gonna sound like it's coming from one place, but it's coming from no place. I'm like, I have no idea where this is coming from in some ways. Uh, but my question for discussion is somewhat related to my previous comments via the kind of feelings around teaching that compels the above kind of thought process. But it's also informed by your engagement with people who are kind of thinking about pleasure. That happens like a couple of times when you're thinking about like Jennifer Nash. But also there's this like little citation where you're like, this is kind of like this identification of Munoz. And I'm like, I don't think so. I think that you're doing something a little bit better, not better, that's not the word, a little bit different from how Munoz is approaching things in terms of discernment. And kind of the risk for me is that it'll sound like I'm trying to ask you about, jouissance and enjoyment and the kind of psychoanalytic language, but I don't think I quite am. But that all of that comes to how do you think Black iconoclasm as discernment in terms of how you're kind of thinking about it, or outside of discernment, changes how we might think about pleasure and affect more generally? But I'm really kind of concerned about pleasure. Like maybe another word that's not the same as pleasure or affect here could be fun. But even then, I think that's a pretty risky word in a lot of different ways. But yeah, I'll just kind of put the ball in your court after that one.
Yeah, so I mean, I think in a general sense, the creation of a racial iconography is meant to place Western man on a pedestal to produce a sort of psychic enjoyment and pleasure in constructing themselves over, blackness and then other people of color, and so there's a kind of enjoyment in the projection of this social fiction that is race, and then imposing that to gain some sort of I guess in the popular discourse we call that, I guess, privilege, right? So there's that sort of enjoyment in the projection. Even thinking like there's something enjoyable about that white kid on the train that looks at Fanon and says, "Look, a Negro," right? There's almost a confirmation of a racial iconography that he has perhaps talked about with his parents, seen through the films, and now it's like, oh, look, a real one right there, right? There's an enjoyment there, and also a fear, which itself is a kind of attraction, right? Then there is, I was thinking about this question in terms of the pedagogical stuff that you mentioned. There is an enjoyment in replicating an iconic narrative of racial progress. Like, we had this, and I can point to this figure, and this thing changed, and look, the U.S. is getting better, and we can enjoy the replaying of that narrative. Or even for Black radicals, there's an enjoyment of constructing a static canon of look at this form of radicalism in the 60s. This is the pure form. We need to learn and know the proper, ways that they would have engaged it, because they're the ones who have the answer, right? And so we replicate, and this is sort of how we get to the, like, we have the Dr. Kings, we have even the Malcolm X's, right? Now we have the Alicia Garzas, the Patrisse Cullors, right? We kind of etch out a pantheon, a marble pantheon of iconic thinkers, and there's an enjoyment in that. There's an enjoyment or a euphoria around, the Obama presidency, the potential Harris presidency. And that euphoria makes it hard for those to say, well, hold on a minute. Like, do we really support this cop, right? Do we really support this post-racial idea where Obama on one hand can say Trayvon would be my son, but I don't think that discrimination is endemic to all policing, right? These slippages, right? It makes it hard to question these icons because it takes the joy out the room, right? It's like, everyone wants to have that '08 change moment again. And so those it takes, and that's actually something that Calvin Warren talks about in the introduction of ontological, it's ontological terror, right? Is the title. That moment where everyone's like, oh, racial progress, and he's like, maybe not, and they're all like, you're doing a disservice to our youth and taking away hope. So I think there's a kind of enjoyment on all sides of it, which I think is in fact why Wilderson in Afro-Pessimism says that if we actually look at it, even like Black liberation isn't even necessarily in the interest of so-called professed Black revolutionaries, because there are these sort of attachments to that feel-good enjoyment of being the one who has the answer, rather than admitting, as I say throughout the book, that none of us got the answer on our own, right? And so, and thinking about this pedagogical question again, I think you're spot on. Like, I wrestle with what I would call the Fanonian slips in my own teaching, right? When I know that I'm teaching, a predominantly non-Black English undergraduate class, and I know that they will know certain things and not other things, and certain things will make them tense up versus, Dr. King's "I Have a Dream" speech versus the last speech he gives before he's assassinated, right? And he's like, live up to what you said on paper, right? And he's like organizing across segregated, like, unionizing, right? And the radical communist king is taken away, and we get the Lime statue, right, in DC. We have it with BLM and all the fears about abolishing the police, to that becoming defund the police, to that becoming vote for the police. It goes with, am I going to get up and say that there's a genocide happening in Palestine right now? To I'm going to, not do, like, actually, I was thinking, Dylan Rodriguez said this recently. He said that we often forget our responsibility as the kind of writers and teachers we want to be, to authorize every rebellion. right? That we actually forget that responsibility because we get so caught up in the pleasures of this petite bourgeois life that we're trying to carve out for ourselves, and the tenure and this and that, and we actually begin to betray the very reasons we got here in the first place. And so there's another level of protection and enjoyment and moderating in your own teaching, that I'm not immune to that, but I think the point of Black iconoclasm is to say that there needs to be a constant self process of interrogation to recognize those residues in our own thinking and to actually like genuinely confront them rather than to use it and say, well, nobody's perfect and just excuse it, right? To actually use that as a starting point to constantly move forward and evolve. And on the flip side, of course, there's the throwing the ideas that your students have like on his head, right? And seeing that moment of unenjoyment, discomfort, and then, perhaps then there is maybe that space for at least some of them of like, oh, wait, well, this means that I might have this other opportunity. Even something as small as like, have you ever looked at your students and been like, you can kind of do what you want for this? And then they look at you and they're like, what do you mean? Like, because they're so used to just like, here's the blueprint, reproduce this formula, tell me what you think I want you to think, right? Even when you try to have a conversation about social justice, and it's like I was talking to them about like this like particular situation with Sonia Massey, right? And one of these non-Black students raised their hand. It's like, it's because you're because the article is just like cops are all bad. And like, personally, I have my thoughts, but pedagogically, my point was to make a comment on the particular situation. And it feels like sometimes the students want to give you the tagline of what is socially acceptable because they want to enjoy being part of this progressive culture. They don't want to be the one that's canceled, right? And so again, we have students that are trying to become a new version, like become another version of their teachers, right? To repeat, to regurgitate, to fall in line with the disciplinary norm, the pop culture norm. They're trying to live up to a particular standard, right? Rather than inventing something new, right? And so I think pedagogically, then, what does it look like to disorder your own teaching practice and the examples you use, the form of your teaching, the things that you assign, but also getting your students to move past the how do I replicate and how do I invent something, and know that it doesn't necessarily have to be perfect, but committing to that process. And I think that is sort of a performative undisciplining in the words of Christina Sharp.
Yeah, actually, that led me to like my question, which I guess that and it's related to the panelists. I want to engage everybody. So I feel like most of you already answered, but I wanted like to keep this conversation. Like, how do you envision your engagement with Black iconoclasm? What do you see as a long-term implications of reframing Black iconoclasm in a way that Dr. A does, and how does directly relate to Black studies and the way that you approach Black studies with your different projects? And I say this because I was especially captivated listening to your remarks of how each of you approached the project from your different like experiences, identities, and work. So I was kind of curious of how do you envision Black iconoclasm in your own projects?
All right. So right now, I'm currently working on two projects right now. One called Haunted Femmes, Haunting Spectators, and the second being Becoming, No Humans Involved in 3 acts. So I'll start with this. So the Black struggle with the Western abstract and often obtuse question, is the Black human, after centuries of the world's violent response to of no or the not quite, met at the impasse of the hesitant response of yes, yes. The yes to the Black human category would necessitate a violent imperative and requisite for how Black people claim, uphold, and establish our own human in order. We establish who is human through the render of who is not. This is all arbitrary, subject to change at any time, which is a demonstration of how methodological the human truly is. But in my work, I try to get into this relation of the femmes, the mad ones, the trans ones, the whore ones, the ugly ones, the beautiful ones, the ones who like to party, the ones who like to do drugs, the ones who like to fuck, those who do not, the ones who are a bit excessive and seem to do a little too much. They are barred geographically, ontologically, physically, psychically, and spiritually from the human through the watching and spectatorial practices of who I identify as the Black public. Ontology speaks to the dual contradiction of relation and existence. And so while I mostly stand in agreement with Black negationists as a Black negationist on their positions on humanism through Fanonian philosophy, my departure is that of actually ontology. The status of non-being is still concomitant with being in the same ways that undesirability is still an extension of desirability. Negationist thinkers, David Marriott, Calvin Warren, and Respondent Bradley are correct in their assertions of the overrepresented forces of ontology and phenomenology. Relationality is not concomitant with the affirmative, as the enclosure of violence enveloped by anti-Blackness is not the negation of relation, but rather the connective tissue that holds the vestibule of Blackness and the brutality of the matter of whiteness together. So as Excel Carrera discusses ontological or phenomenological unreadability, and Marriott posits the lack of relevancy of ontology as a mode to understand Black existence, it could still be argued that ontology does exist. The dialectic of violence between the white being and Black non-being does not make there be any less of a relation. It is just a violent one. Ontology may appear to be much about nothing, but the assumptive logic of uselessness can be likened to how an anti-Black world reacts to the deviant Black femme figure as nothing or useless or as useless. Nothingness would at least offer a priori for violence, but as violence follows nothing could be further from the truth. Instead, I would like to think about the relationship between ontology and the deviant Black femme figure as an excessive preoccupation with beingness, a type of paradoxical relation between overrepresentation and the underrepresentation. So therefore, I would like to note that my use of ontology animates the Blackness designation of being and existence through the extension of violence as facilitated by a Black-Black relation. The mythic Black designation of the human is constructed based on the deviant Black femme's negation and presumed irrelevance, which produces something else for this femme to be. And so additionally, in this second work that I'm working on alongside Haunted Femmes, Haunting Spectators, in many ways, when you were talking about pleasure, I think that this is kind of where I'm trying to go as well in this second project. So the second devices that I'm interested in with my other work is the anti-Black erotic of humanism as a composition toward an imperial Black and gender and sexual politic. So here I have created a critical porno that I'm working on called Becoming on Humanist Edging as a means to antagonize these attachments to a so-called Black human or humanisms. And I focus on one so-called lumpen figure, that being the Black whore figure in this particular work.
Yeah, I can talk for a second. I'll there's one I won't know for a second. I feel like this is one of those kind of books where it's gonna have effects on your writing that you don't even realize it's having. I'm like, oh well, it'll be like 2 years later, I'll be like, oh wow, I learned a new thing from this book, out of nowhere. But there's I think three kind of entry points for me. First is in terms of writing itself, but in terms of citational practices, I feel like it kind of reading especially a chapter on Fanon, I was also thinking of in terms of pedagogy and kind of how people teach the right kind of Black scholars to latch onto in a specific kind of way. And I think that what you're pushing kind of helps us not feel so attached to here is my correct interpretation of the right kind of way of approaching XYZ, but here is kind of my entry point. And I think that was one of the interesting parts of reading that chapter, especially. The second part is kind of thinking about like almost like white nationalist iconoclasm, like that they get really obsessed with like, oh, we must defeat the image of Obama, we must defeat, the image of uh, um, Kamala Harris right now, but previous kind of Black women who are in specific positions of power, like Cori Bush or Ilhan Omar, right? Um, Even if partially because of how social movements kind of produce a certain iconography around certain politicians and stuff, and kind of thinking through what that iconoclasm is kind of doing in a certain sense and why it's not like some sort of liberatory thing that it demonstrates some sort of break from white nationalists to the broader establishment that many people on the left who want to see some sort of recruitable figure in the white nationalists as a potential radical can kind of gravitate towards, which is kind of silly to me. But uh, yeah, that's all. And the last thing is thinking about. I've been thinking a lot about like the everyday forms of racial rhetorical criticism, or kind of analyzing when people say racist stuff or anti-racist stuff that we pay attention to and talk with each other about outside of the academy or just outside of publications, and seeing what kind of and if that can be partially a practice of or adjacent to or done by certain folks, kind of like Black iconoclasm, then I think that kind of it's getting me to think about what the potentials of those kind of everyday conversations are and look like, and the weirdness of how people things launch off of those moments in everyday life where we make judgments about what other people say that help us navigate the world, and perhaps in an antagonistic kind of fashion, or preferably in an antagonistic kind of fashion. That's all I got for thinking about the implications for my own work. I'll be able to tell you more in about 4 to 5 years.
I appreciate both sets of comments here, and so I'm really interested in what you said here, Z, about the idea of being and non-being, perhaps being the construction of a kind of dialectic, which sort of leaves out possibilities for thinking ontology differently. That a violent relation is not necessarily a non-relation, right? Then the other thing that I'm hearing is that in producing this notion of a Black human that is in some sense counter or oppositional to Western man, that part of what happens is this mimicry of Western man in constructing a hierarchy, perhaps even unconsciously, because of the search for epistemological closure, and in doing so constructing its own internal other within Black human, which is this like Black whore figure, right? um and or the sort of deviant Black femme, as you said. And so yeah, I think that's pretty interesting. It's like, again, there's like a desire to have epistemological closure in this idea of a human, and then in doing so, it then the residues appear in the construction of this other internal other within Blackness. And that also makes me think of just generally that, like, even on a more like base level, the reactive desire, like post-abolition, to like reconstruct the Black family unit in a way that mimics the white family unit, to like prove that the new Negro can sort of like, like pull themselves up, by their bootstraps in the like Booker T way, or to somehow shock the American democratic system, in the Du Boisian talented 10th way, right? Which leads to the construction of those, things like Morehouse and the whole like Black male savior of the race discourse. But yeah, I think that there's this in some ways relates to the conversation that I've heard you have with Nicholas Brady before, about the way that we construct whiteness as the thing that is the problem, and that Blackness is somehow pure, in the sense of, if we can just escape or run away from, be fugitive, from the white world, that somehow that space is free of residues, right? And what a lot of these scholars in this conversation have argued is that what that does is it constructs this sort of purity politics of saying, well, if you haven't escaped, if you have residues, well, you're not doing Black politics correctly, right? Because Black politics is fugitive, right? And so you're just reproducing this white thing. And it's like, it could be in some sense, but what if it's something more than that, which is our very notion of Blackness, not just whiteness, right? Because for non-black skin, white mass, both sides of the dialectic have to be called into question and undone. And so the very notion of Black sociality and liberation itself contains those residues, and so I think you're doing sort of important work then to see how that manifests. And then, I was thinking about your work, Dr. Trebrill. What I see happening in your work from my own perspective is, I think that the mainstream white liberal society likes to create a kind of reactive iconography and say, look at this spectacular image of a neo-Nazi over here. Look how bad they are. Let's stop them and vote for us against the boogeyman figure, right? But in fact, your work shows us that even something as spectacular as the Dylann Roof Manifesto contains discourses that at its very root are shared by white liberals. And so the anxieties endemic to the white psyche across its various genres, liberal, conservative, whatever, that there's something there that throws into crisis the epistemological closure that white liberals cling to in their reactive critiques of neo-Nazis and MAGA, right? To put it in Dylan Rodriguez's terms, Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama are politically first cousins, right? Those figures are first cousins with a Trump figure, right? That they're all connected to the broader iconography, even if they register differently within that iconography. And then, poking holes in the basis for those anxieties then create space for inventing something beyond it. And so those are just things that I'm thinking of. Or I'm thinking of Allison, who, brilliant student, by the way, has this interesting discussion. We constantly come back to this theme of almost a notion of Ecuador that doesn't necessarily pay attention to the rural, right? That even within the depictions of Blackness, there is this sort of misogynoir, right? This anti-Black woman discourse that occurs within this supposed banner of Afro-Ecuadorian studies, right? And that's not even accounting the broader issues with Ecuadorian society. So then poking holes not only in Ecuador as a whole, but then perhaps the overrepresentation of the urban and male, right, in the scholarship and practice is a kind of disordering that creates space for new types of organizing, new types of thinking. And as you said, you might not necessarily have all those answers. It'll be messy. There will be failures along the way. But that process of disordering is important. Last thing I'll say, I was thinking about this pedagogical stuff again, and one thing that I do is I remind my students that I perhaps don't look like the professor they imagine that they would see at the beginning of the semester, and remind them that it's okay if they don't have to live up to a particular image of what they think a student needs to be. I'll even mess with them. Some semesters I'll sit in the back of the room and act like a student and be like, where is this guy? What's this weird Greek name? If he's not here in 15 minutes, we out. And then they're like, yeah. And then I get up and they're like, whoa, and then I'm like, and this is a lesson in rhetorical ethos and who you think looks like a professor. And, or I was thinking about in grad school, we had a white professor who wanted us to do some UN simulation about climate change. And trying to come to some pragmatic agreement to curb emissions. And I was the media, so and then some of my colleagues, including my partner Corinne, were in this class, right? And they were they were given the third world countries, right? And so we showed up to the simulation, and instead of actually in good faith doing the simulation, showed up and we were like, this whole simulation is bad. The US and these Western European countries are at the root of this crisis. You need to cut all of it now, or we're not doing anything and the whole world will burn. And they're like, if we're going to, because it was after day one, day two, it was everything that they kept talking about with their nitty gritty policy changes still meant the 1.5 Celsius increase, which meant we die, but they live. And at some point we were like, how about no? How about all of it goes? And I just remember the professor just being like, I never even considered that someone could completely undo this simulation and just make it about BLM journalists aligning with all these countries across the globe in this hypothetical simulation to push the Western world. So this is something very small, but it's like, you know, taking the established order of events and scrapping it, right, and creating space for a new conversation could happen in the classroom.